All right. Well, it is 5 o'clock here in Minnesota, and I am Krista with the International Wolf Center. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are joined by Merijn, who is going to be talking about recolonization of wolves in the Great Lakes region. And this webinar is being recorded, so everyone will receive a link to the recording within about a week of tonight. So we will also have time for questions at the end, so you can type those into the Q&A tab. That's the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can type them in at any point during the webinar, and we'll answer those live at the end. And again, thanks so much for joining us. So Merijn started his academic endeavors with a bachelor's and master's degree in philosophy. And during that, his focus was on the environmental philosophy underlying Aldo Leopold's land ethic. And that led him to pursue a formal education in ecology. So after completing 2 master's degrees that related to the studies of the natural world, Merijn worked for several conservation organizations such as BirdLife International. And in 2020, he moved from Europe to the US to start his PhD research on gray wolves. And at Michigan State University, Merijn's research was primarily on the spatial ecology of gray wolves in the Great Lakes region. But currently, he is out in Colorado and is a postdoctoral researcher at the Rocky Mountain Research Station and is working on a project investigating the effects of environmental drought on wildlife. So we are really excited for this webinar. We've got quite a few people who have joined us. So again, Merijn, thank you, and thank you to everyone else who has joined us tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I want to start off by thanking Krista and the International Wolf Center and all the people there for having me. It's an honor to be here, and thank you all for joining. So yeah, my name is Merijn van den Bosch, and I'll be talking about the spatial ecology of gray wolves in the Western Great Lakes region, where wolf range currently spans parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And more specifically, my research focused on the spatial ecology of wolves in response to human-caused disturbance of the landscape in the past, in the present, and in the future. And all of this research, this whole project was kind of unique in that it used data from the Departments of Natural Resources of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So they all grouped their data together, and I got to use that, which was great for me and the people I worked with. And then those DNRs also cooperated with different various agencies, such as Michigan State University, which I then was a part of, but also the USDA, USGS, various tribes from the 3 states that were involved, and so on and so on. So all this work I'm presenting was only made possible through the cooperation of many, many people. And most of those people have been working on wolves for decades, as opposed to me, who only did his PhD on wolves over the past 4 years. So having said that, let's get started. And first, we'll have a look at the past process of recolonization. And we can say that that process in the Great Lakes region started around 1974, when wolves were federally listed under the Endangered Species Act. More specifically, we'll be looking at how wolves have changed their space use over time, so between 1974 and now, and whether it is still changing. So, as I mentioned, the first objective is to investigate whether wolves have altered their space use over time, because one could expect that once prime wolf habitat is all saturated, wolves will start occupying less ideal habitat. Secondly, we wanted to estimate the rates at which wolves recolonize their current range. Has it become quicker as time moved on, that they start progressively reoccupying areas at a more rapid speed, or did it slow down over time? And answering these questions can provide valuable information that's useful to policy and management of gray wolves in the region. So here we have a map of the 3 states that are involved, and in the white stripe pattern, we can see where wolves were still present in 1974 at the time of listing under the Endangered Species Act. This is very approximate, by the way. It's not like there's this actual straight border. So it's only in northeastern Minnesota and then Isle Royale National Park. Coincidentally or not, both areas are areas with very little human disturbance. So keep that in mind. And then the dark green, everything that's dark green represents current wolf range throughout the 3 states. So we see wolves have greatly expanded their range over time. And now the question is whether the areas that have been more recently occupied by wolves, whether those are different in any way from those places where they were never extirpated. Another question we can ask is whether we can expect wolf range to increase even further down into the gray areas. So to answer these questions, we used winter survey data, and that mostly consists of snow tracking data that's collected in an effort led by the Departments of Natural Resources of each state, but with a lot of assistance, again, from the tribes, USDA, volunteers from the public as well. So all of this was made possible because of their tireless efforts going out into the cold and in the snow and tracking wolves. And so we used data from the first year it was available for all 3 states, which was 1989, all the way through 2020. And we split the data into 6 periods to allow us to compare these periods in terms of the landscape use of wolves. And we looked at the landscape in terms of 2 factors of human disturbance, namely proportions of agricultural cover, so how much of the landscape is being used for agricultural activities, and secondly, human population density. So in this case, we looked at the number of humans living per square kilometer. Oh, there we go. So here we see that as variables relating to human disturbance go up, the suitability of that place for wolves goes down. Now that's a little vague, but see, for example, human population density. We're looking here at 0 to 25 people per square kilometer. We see that at 0 people per square kilometer, the suitability for wolves, so how well suited that area is for wolves to live in, is very high. But then when we go to say 25, which honestly isn't that much, 25 people per square kilometer, in rural areas it is, but urban areas are often 300-400 people per square kilometer. But anyways, as soon as we get to 25, there's almost, it's so much lower. But what's more interesting is that it differs greatly between the periods. If you look at the first period of data, so 1989 to 1994, we see a very strong negative relationship. So as soon as you get to 25 people per square kilometer, the model says there's absolutely no way that wolves would live here, it seems, because the suitability for wolves is 0. While if we look at the latest data, so the data collected between 2016 and 2020, yeah, it's still not as suitable for wolves as if there were no people living there, but it's not that bad either. So what does that tell us, right? That's what we'll get into in a little bit. And we kind of saw the same for proportion of agriculture, that pattern, though the negative relationship with that variable remains stronger. So we can see that also in the latest period of data, there's still a strong negative relationship with proportions of agriculture, while there was more change over time for human population density. So because wolves started occupying areas with higher human disturbance, the amount of wolf habitat predicted for the last period was much higher than for the first period, about little over 200,000 square kilometer in the last period of habitat versus a little under 150,000 square kilometers of habitat between 1989 and 1994. Another interesting thing is that we can see that these increases in habitat seem to slow down over. If you look at the habitat gain between the first 2 periods, which is between 1989 and 2000, the model estimates that about 20,000 square kilometers was gained. But if we look at the time between the last 2 periods, so between 2011 and 2020, over those 9 years, the model estimates that only an additional 5,000 square kilometers was gained in wolf habitat. And so if we visualize this on the map of the study area, we can see in dark green areas that were habitat in 1989, so from the start of our model data, and remain habitat throughout the entire duration. So from 1989 to 2020, dark green was and is habitat. But in pink, we see habitat that was predicted by the model for the last period, so 2016 to 2020, that was not yet habitat in the first period. So everything is pink is wolf habitat that was gained somewhere between 1989 and 2020. And it may not look like it is that much, but that's also because all of that recently predicted habitat is mostly in the periphery of already existing habitat. So it doesn't look like that much, but in fact, it shows an increase of about 25%. So what we can conclude from this is that predicted habitat increased continuously between 1989 and 2020. But the increases in wolf habitat slowed down over time. And that suggests that wolves now may be present in most areas that they could occupy in the region. And the goal of federal protection was to conserve wolves in a significant portion of their range. And a lot of the debate is on, okay, but what do we mean by a significant portion? And that hasn't been properly defined. And so there are many differing interpretations of that. One interpretation could be that wolves are protected because we need to conserve them in a significant portion of their historical range in the Great Lakes region. And if that is true, one may say that the goal has been achieved because wolf range seems to be stabilizing. They don't seem to be occupying a lot of new areas. But it can also refer to a significant portion of historical range that if we look beyond the Great Lakes region. And then the conclusions may be very different. And so we'll take a closer look at that now. So here we will look at the present state of wolf space use in the Great Lakes region. And we will use that information to estimate what other places within, but also beyond the Great Lakes region may be suitable for further natural recolonization by wolves. So as mentioned, the first objective was to estimate the current range of wolves, and then we used it to predict how much habitat is still available to wolves throughout their entire historical range in the eastern USA. However, habitat availability is not sufficient for recolonization because wolves also need to be able to reach that potential habitat. Therefore, the third objective was here to conduct a connectivity analysis throughout former range in the eastern US. And a connectivity analysis, that's where you look at how connected or how fragmented different patches of habitat are. And for that part of the analysis, we also included southern Canada, because in southern Canada, there's a lot of wolf habitat and there's a lot of places occupied by wolves. And so it's very relevant to assess connectivity between habitat in southern Canada and habitat in the northernmost parts of the eastern USA. And finally, we evaluated the protected area status not only of currently occupied wolf habitat in the Great Lakes region, but also of other wolf habitat that our model estimated to remain in the eastern US. So here we can see a map of the study area. And on the left, we can see how it's integrated into the continent. So we can see here, this is what research has shown used to be the range of gray wolves in the US, in the eastern USA. Of course, they were in the West too, but other researchers are doing that part of the US. We limited ourselves here to these states. And then we see that here, there's a big part missing. You may be wondering why. That's because based on archaeological evidence, gray wolves supposedly would not have lived there. It could instead have been red wolves. That's another important thing to point out is throughout this research, we just looked at gray wolves. We didn't really start thinking about, okay, but if we find habitat somewhere, what about the red wolves? Aren't they supposed to be the ones there? So we didn't consider red wolves at all. This is purely focused on gray wolves. Say for Mexican wolves, for example. We purely focused on the gray wolves. So we can see the map of the study area and how it is situated within the eastern US. And then you can also see that we integrated part of southern Canada so we could assess connectivity between these parts here at the border. And the general landscape composition is shown through the land cover index. And natural cover, so landscape cover like forests or wetlands, or grasslands, they're all shown in dark green. And then in beige, we have agricultural land cover, and developed or urban land cover, so mostly villages and cities, are seen in purple. For example, you can see Chicago right here, or Detroit, you can see right here. And then you can also see a lot of gray dots throughout the northern parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin and the UP in Michigan. And those are the wolf presence points that we used to answer the research questions. So again, the wolf data we used were winter survey data, so snow tracking data, but this time we only used recent data because, as previously shown, the way wolves use space over time can differ over time. And so it's important, if you want a more up-to-date look on what wolf habitat is, that you only use recent data. So we used winter data collected between 2017 and 2020. And we looked at how wolves use the landscape in terms of agricultural land cover, natural land cover, human population density again, but also elevation. And we also looked at habitat connectivity, as I mentioned. We did a least cost path analysis, which is a very, it's all a lot of terminology, but basically what you do there is you have two patches of habitat, and then based on how suitable the habitat is deemed to be by the model, it calculates the path that would be the most plausible for wolves to move through. But so what linkages between habitat patches are we particularly interested in? Well, we're particularly interested in those that link large tracts of remaining wolf habitat where populations of wolves could live. And so we classified the habitat patches based on something that we found in the literature that was written in the Wolf Recovery Plan, which was already drafted in 1992. And that stated that for a viable wolf population to occur somewhere, those wolves need an area of over 12,800 square kilometers. Now, of course, that's just an estimate, but that's what we used. 12,800 square kilometers, but then that population, if it wants to persist long into the future, it would still be dependent upon some exchange with other populations, for example, to keep genetic diversity high. And then the estimate was that an area double that size, so 25,600 square kilometer, would be sufficient for an entirely independent wolf population. But so we used that cutoff of 12,800 square kilometers as a cutoff for a population-sized core area, which means a habitat, a patch of contiguous habitat that is large enough for a wolf population. And so we call those population-sized core areas, and I'll refer to them from now on as PCAs. Important to remember that, because I'll use the acronym a lot because it's way too long a term to say fully each time. So we found 6 such areas, 6 PCAs, and only one of those is currently occupied, and I bet you know which one. But together, those 6 PCAs comprised over 59% of all habitat that was predicted to occur in the eastern US by our model. So let's have a look at the results. Firstly, as one would expect, the suitability of areas for wolves had a strongly negative relationship with human population densities and proportions of agriculture. And the map background color shows us this, whereby dark areas present wolf habitat and bright areas represent areas unsuitable for wolves, where they could not establish and likely would also have a tough time traveling through safely. And if we think about what the landscape looks like on this map, that kind of makes sense. We look at, Wisconsin, Minnesota here. This is the areas that there are a lot of woods, a lot of wetlands. There's a lot of natural land cover. If we go down here, it's going to be a lot more agriculture. Here, you're going to have cities and what have you. And as such, it's going to be less suitable for wolves. So we found 6 large areas called population-sized core areas, PCAs, that could hold a wolf population, but only one of them is currently occupied, and that's, of course, the one where wolves are right now, which is the Great Lakes core area, which includes parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the UP in Michigan. The 5 other ones in order of size were the Great Plains PCA, which is this huge tract of more or less contiguous habitat. Then that is the biggest one of all by far. Then second in size is the Great Lakes PCA. Thirdly, we have the Appalachian Mountains PCA, which is also quite big. So that's mostly Tennessee, and so think of the Smoky Mountains. Then fourth, you have New England, the New England core area, which is here, so quite big. Then fifth in size, we have the Adirondacks core area here, New York and Western Vermont. And then the smallest core area, still disjunct from the Great Lakes core area, really, is the northern half of the lower peninsula of Michigan, right here. And you can also see the linkages that we looked at in particular that were most interesting to us because the connectivity was a little higher than in others. For example, we also calculated connectivity between the Great Plains PCA and the Appalachian PCA. And probably that linkage went something like this, like going through that bit of forest there, and maybe a little like that or like that. And then, but honestly, if we're realistic, that's not going to happen, and not anytime soon. So we were most interested in the ones that seemed a little more plausible. Those are the priority linkages, so to speak. And even those priority linkages really did not have great connectivity. There's a lot of fragmentation between these big areas of wolf habitat, particularly here in what we call the Corn Belt, south of Kern Wolf Range, but also here around the St. Lawrence River, which separates Canadian wolf habitat from the northeastern USA. Nevertheless, the two linkages that our connectivity analysis found to be most plausible for natural recolonization would be here, connecting Canadian Wolf Range to New England, right here. And the second one was, which I'll get into a little more later, was the connection between the Great Lakes PCA here and the Lower Michigan Peninsula PCA, which went here over the Straits of Mackinac. Let's see. There we go. And in terms of protected areas, we found that 17.5% of all wolf habitat currently has a protected status. So whether it's occupied by wolves or not, all the habitat that all that the model considers to be wolf habitat, 17.5% of it is protected. Some PCAs have a much lower proportion of protected area than others. For example, if we look at the Great Lakes one, which is the only one that's occupied, about 55% of all viable wolf habitat there has a protected status, which is not that bad. But if we look at the Great Plains, then we can see that it's very low. It's about 10% only there is protected. So that the average level of protection throughout the PCAs is brought down significantly by the Great Plains because it's also the biggest one. And protected parts of those PCAs are largely made up of state and federal lands, and then private or NGO lands together make up about 10%. So, because humans have had far-reaching impacts on the landscape since wolves were extirpated from most of the eastern USA, our model estimates that about 65% of what used to be wolf habitat is no longer suitable. That's all of that light green here. That's all no longer suitable, though it used to be wolf habitat. Yet there also is still a lot of wolf habitat present in the eastern USA that is not occupied. Our model estimates that only 12% of what is still wolf habitat is currently occupied. And we know that that's only here in the Great Lakes region. In terms of habitat connectivity, we found that successful recolonization of other PCAs through Kern Wolf Range in either the Great Lakes or southern Canada is obstructed by habitat fragmentation in the form of agriculture and high human population densities, and particularly in the so-called Corn Belt, but also around the St. Lawrence River in Canada. Nevertheless, that's also where the most plausible linkages are. And for example, if we think of the one over the Straits of Mackinac that connects the Great Lakes PCA with the Michigan Lower Peninsula PCA, that has in fact been crossed by wolves several times even, although it's been a while, I think, since the last wolf made that crossing. which also has to do with how often the ice freezes over the strait and how often the boats break up the ice to get through it and stuff like that. And also, those were the two linkages that we found to be most plausible, but it doesn't mean that the other ones are not possible. When I say that wolves will probably not get from the Great Plains PCA to the Appalachian Mountains PCA, I'm saying probably. I can't say for sure that they won't, but it seems very unlikely. But for example, if we look at the linkage between current range in Canada and the Adirondacks, that as well has been crossed. In 2021, a wolf from presumably from Canada made it all the well. It didn't actually get to that patch of habitat, otherwise it might have still been alive. It went a little more to the west, and it was shot near the Finger Lakes accidentally by a hunter. Well, not accidentally shot, it was mistakenly shot by a hunter who misidentified it as a coyote. So it does happen. It's not because the connectivity is low that it's impossible. Let's see. So if we think back about federal wolf protection and the reason why it is there to protect wolves in a significant portion of their range, we now have a completely different way of looking at it, because they may be present in a significant portion of their range in the Great Lakes region, but beyond that, there still is a lot of wolf habitat where they are currently absent. So for the last part of the presentation, we're going to have an outlook, a future look at wolves in the Great Lakes region. And we will look at what projections of climate change and land use change in the 21st century might imply for the wolf population that lives in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So again, we quantified the relationship between wolf landscape use and land cover, but this time also the relationship between wolf landscape use and climate variables, such as average temperature, monthly rainfall, etc. And we then used that to predict wolf range in the Great Lakes under different scenarios of land cover change, but also under different scenarios of climate change for the remainder of this century. And we did that using 4 different scenarios called SSP scenarios, which stands for shared socioeconomic pathways. But that's not very relevant here. But what is relevant is that they differ in the degree of sustainability that the future of mankind holds. So we can see, for example, in SSP1 and SSP2, we could keep global surface temperature change around a little under or a little above 2 degrees Celsius, while SSP5 or SSP8, that's more continuing business as usual, or even starting to emit more greenhouse gases. We could end up with over 4 degrees Celsius in global surface temperature change. So it's just important to remember the SSPs, when they have low numbers, they're in general sustainable futures, predicted future. And when they're higher numbers, then they are likely unsustainable projections for the future. So the SSP scenarios also imply different projections of land use within our study area. So we can see here that in the 2 more sustainable SSPs, in green and in orange, there would be an increase in forest cover across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and there would be a decrease in pasture or agriculture. And then conversely, in the less sustainable scenarios, we'd see, well, a small loss in proportion of forest across the study area, and we'd see a stabilization in agriculture. Then grasslands, depending on the scenario, it would either remain stable or decrease, and urban cover, it will increase no matter what. It doesn't matter how sustainable or unsustainable our future is, urban land cover will increase. But it is important to know that grassland and urban land cover together really only make up a fraction of the landscape. For example, urban land cover throughout the 3 states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, currently is about 1.5%. And that may become 3%, but that's still peanuts if you compare it to the amount of land that's used either as, whether it's either forest cover or there's agricultural land cover. So those 2 are going to be the most important in modeling what is habitat for wolves and what is not. So again, we used the recent winter survey data that was collected between 2017 and 2020, and we used it to model current wolf range in the Great Lakes. And that helped us to quantify relationships between wolf space use on the one hand and land use and climate variables on the other hand. And then we used that information to project wolf range into the future under the various SSP scenarios. And here we can see the projections of wolf habitat under those various scenarios. And what does this tell us? Well, it really depends on the scenario, but in the more sustainable scenarios of SSP1 and SSP2, we'd see respectively a smaller increase of about 10% in wolf habitat. So one is just how the situation is now. So if it's 1.1, that means a 10% increase. So it would either be a 10% increase, and in the other sustainable scenario, it may be a pretty big increase in wolf habitat, up to 35%. Now, of course, these come with some uncertainty, as you can see in the bars. That's sort of where the model estimates the true value to be, somewhere within those bars. And for the two less sustainable scenarios of our future, we can see that really not a lot of habitat loss for wolves is predicted by the end of the century. They would probably maybe have a very small loss of a couple of percent, or it would just remain stable, or maybe a teeny increase here in SSP5. But in general, we can say under the unsustainable scenarios, wolf habitat would remain relatively stable. And if we visually represent that on the study area, we have here in the left column, this is just the same map 4 times. That is what is currently wolf habitat as based on our model, and that aligns pretty well with where wolves are currently. And then on the right, we have future predicted habitat for wolves by 2090 for the different scenarios. And so we see that 10% increase here. In yellow, we see additional habitat that is predicted to be there by 2090. And in red, we see habitat that's predicted to disappear. So not to be wolf habitat anymore in 2090. We can see a little change in the first scenario, not that great, but overall there's more gained habitat by 2090 than there is lost habitat. So there's a small gain there. And then the second sustainable scenario, we see a really big increase, gained habitat, and almost no loss. So that's where that 35% increase comes from. And under the unsustainable scenarios, we can kind of see the same thing for both of those, in terms that there is some lost habitat, there is some gained habitat, but they kind of even each other out, and it doesn't seem like wolf habitat altogether will change that much, or at least quantities of wolf habitat may not change that much, because we only look here at, will something still be wolf habitat or not? We're not looking at of how high quality is that wolf habitat, because when we looked into it, we did find, for example, that while we may have a 35% increase in wolf habitat here in that second scenario, that newly gained wolf habitat is not as prime wolf habitat as you'd find further up north. There would be some more agriculture, there'd be some more human disturbance in general, but still, based on our model, based on where wolves are right now, it would probably be suitable habitat for wolves. So we can conclude from this that while wolf habitat could increase by up to 35% in the future, it's also possible that wolf habitat will remain stable, depending on what scenario comes true. And thus, under current projections for the 21st century, land use and climate change seem unlikely to threaten the Great Lakes wolf population. And this is also going to be relevant to Great Lakes, to policymakers, because this is one of the things that policymakers assess. Are they threatened by climate change or not? So to recap on the 3 analyses, we started out by looking at how wolves have recolonized the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And it appears that most areas suitable for wolves are now occupied. So there's a stabilization or an apparent stabilization of wolf range within the region. Beyond the region, there is still plenty of wolf habitat across the eastern USA, but further natural recolonization is inhibited by low habitat connectivity due to high human landscape disturbance. And finally, we saw that land use and climate change, as they are expected for the 21st century, are unlikely to negatively affect the range of wolves in the Great Lakes region. So I'd like to thank you all for being here and listening to the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Great, Merijn, thank you so much. That was really interesting information, and we do have some questions. So just as a reminder to everyone who has joined us, you can type in your question using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and then we will be working our way through those and answering those live with the rest of our time. So you talked a little bit about, or quite a bit about, kind of those ranges. And so the Great Plains is really a grassland-ish area. It does tend to be more agriculture, have more cattle in it. Did you kind of factor in that kind of cattle component of that and how that relates to quality wolf habitat?
Yeah, so we did in the sense that we looked at the proportions of agricultural land cover versus natural land cover. And so there is a lot of agriculture there, but there's also a lot of more or less unused land, and it's not forest, so it's different wolf habitat than we see in the Great Lakes region. But that doesn't mean it's not wolf habitat, because wolves can live in various places. They can live in forests, but also grasslands, tundra. They're not very picky when it comes to habitat. It's more about where the humans allow them to live. That's really what makes it up. And so that's why we looked at the proportions of agricultural land cover. And so we can see that if you look at the Great Lakes region, if we look at how much proportion of agricultural cover is there and where wolves are there and how much agriculture they can coexist with, the model kind of transpons that to that region, and it says, well, here and here are places with similar proportions of agriculture, and so wolves could probably be there. I mean, that's all theoretical. It depends on whether there's enough prey as well and stuff like that. But based on human population density and based on proportions of agricultural cover, it will look for similar places in other areas, and it will then estimate, well, that's probably going to be wolf habitat. And so I can imagine that, if you look at that map, that's a huge tract of land, but there just truly is a lot of unused space there.
Sure. And as we know, wolves are fantastic dispersers, and so they're kind of walking around and colonizing all kinds of places. As you know, in Colorado, they're being reintroduced as well as walking in there by themselves. So did you, and you talked a little bit about the social kind of carrying capacity as far as where people kind of allow them to live. Did that factor into your projections at all, or was it more just kind of they could live here, but it's not necessarily a feasible thing? Even if they do disperse to these areas, they may not stay.
Exactly. Yeah. So we didn't look at the social component, although our analysis does, in a way, indirectly, it shows that where wolves live is just it just depends on where the landscape is not very disturbed by humans. And that is not per se because wolves hate agricultural fields. They probably don't, because agricultural fields attract a lot of deer. Wolves like deer. It's because of the human risk that's associated with those activities. And why are they risky? Because wolves and humans often have problems coexisting, and humans don't tolerate wolves very well. So really, we just looked at, based on where wolves are now, what other areas in the U.S. may be suitable. But whether they are actually suitable will also depend on whether, if they get there, if humans will allow them to live there. That's what it all depends on in the end.
Sure.
To expand on that a little bit. That is why, if you remember the first map that I showed with where wolves remained, that was only in northeastern Minnesota and Isle Royale. And why is it that they were only left in those places? Because there's fewer humans there. That's why they weren't in the middle of Wisconsin anymore, where they are now, is because those were the last places where they've managed to kind of live separately from humans. And now we see that they can coexist, given protection, given more positive human attitudes. They can coexist, at least in the Great Lakes region. And there is similar habitat, although it might look very different, being grasslands instead of wetlands, etc. But there are areas with similar degrees of human disturbance, so where they could live all across the eastern US. The question is, will people also be able to coexist with them there?
It's kind of the great question. And June joins us from Oregon, and um, wolves have obviously dispersed into Oregon. They are having some issues with them being illegally shot, as well as some conflict in those areas. So, kind of building off of what you were just talking about, do you have any advice that you've come across through your work on how to work on that coexistence part of it?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it's a very good question, and probably the most important question related to the management and conservation of wolves. But it's not really what I looked at through my PhD. I really looked at how do wolves use space and how do they use it in relation to human landscape use. What I did not look at is how do humans perceive wolves, and how can we better coexist. That's a whole that opens up a whole new can of worms, and there's many people doing very successful work on that. But in general, I would say a lot of education is important. There's wolves are not saints. They're not people. I mean, they are a spiritual animal to many people, also indigenous peoples and stuff like that. But in the end, they are an animal, and so they are morally neutral. They're not evil. They're also not benign in the sense that, in that kind of sense. And people do often look at them that way as completely, proponents of wolves are usually a little bit exaggerating when it comes to claims about how fantastic wolves are to the ecosystem, saying that if you put 5 wolves somewhere, it's going to transform the whole ecosystem. Well, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration. And on the other side, people do the same thing, and sometimes even worse. They say all wolves are evil, and they kill as many livestock as they can because they're cruel, and so, and that's all just not really based on the best available scientific knowledge. And so education plays a big part in communicating with people what the best knowledge is, and our knowledge continues to grow as we study wolves.
Exactly. We would strongly agree with you on the education and all these things changing and sharing all that information, which is fantastic. Mike has a question. Did you consider how occupied gray wolf habitat in Europe compares to the predicted wolf habitat in Eastern North America?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And being from Europe myself, that is something I really wanted to do. I couldn't, unfortunately, because I couldn't get my hands on wolf data from Belgium and the Netherlands. But so the latest places to be recolonized in Europe were Belgium and the Netherlands. And I grew up in Belgium. And if you've never been there, or you've never seen movies or something featuring Belgium, and honestly, why would you? There's not that many movies featuring Belgium, but it is enormously crowded. Almost every inch of land is used for something: agriculture, building. There's very little natural areas left. And yet, since about 2018, there's been a pair of wolves. They started procreating. They've had about 3 to 4 litters, I think, maybe 5 by now. There's been poaching. The first litter was poached completely, including the female, I think. Next year, another one came. That's because population in Germany is doing so well, by the way. So they're kind of pushing, because Germany, it's kind of at carrying capacity. So the wolves get pushed into the Netherlands and Belgium, where there's very little good wolf habitat. But so they were in a military reserve that's sometimes used for practice for military vehicles and stuff. Because so there's not too many recreational activities by people, because if you're in a country with very little natural areas, all the people are going to be packed in those small areas if they want to go outside for a walk or mountain biking and such. But so those wolves are persisting there. They're legally protected too. But I am pretty sure that if I use the model for the wolves in the Great Lakes region and I would project it to Western Europe, then I think it would show Belgium as, well, at least the northern part of Belgium where those wolves are, as completely unsuitable. Because they do seem to, I mean, well, it's hard to, I can't make any conclusion on it because I simply don't have the data. But it does seem to me that places that are considered non-habitat by my model for the Great Lakes region seem to be good enough quality for the wolves in Europe. And why that is hard to tell. Like I said, it's a little tricky because, for example, that case in Belgium, those are wolves. They're living on a military reserve. There's no telling whether they would still be there if they were not in a place that's not publicly accessible. And even though they were on a military reserve, there was a poaching incident. They have a litter each year, but each year, the majority of the ones that are born, well, usually not the ones from that year, but the one from next year, they stay around, of course. And then most of the yearlings, once they disperse, it doesn't take long for them to get hit by a car. So the mortality is really high of those dispersers. So it's never going to be enough for a viable population. There's just no space for that. But it is, it's a little victory in conservation in Belgium. Then a country so dominated by humans and their activities to at least have in the northern part one pack, and then the south of Belgium is a little better in terms of natural cover. So there's another pack there, at least one. But there will never be a full-fledged population in Belgium. That's not realistic, unfortunately. Yeah, it's an excellent question, and yeah, it does. I did have the notion, and it's not more than that there is a difference between the space use of wolves in the Great Lakes region and the ones in Europe, and that might just be because the landscape with vast areas of natural land cover that are present in the Great Lakes region, particularly in the northern parts of it, there's just no comparable situation in Europe. So those wolves automatically have to settle for lower quality habitat. That is a potential explanation. But I can't back this up with any data, unfortunately. Not yet. Maybe in the future. I'd love to do some work on that.
With the projection of sustainability for wolves in the Great Lakes region, how do you think this could guide states in their decisions on management, and particularly related to potentially having wolf hunts once they're delisted, of course?
Are we talking about the projections in terms of climate and land use change? So the suitability of areas for wolves throughout the century in the Great Lakes region? Is that what we're referring to?
I think so. Lisa, if I got that wrong, please type in another one to explain it. But that's how I'm interpreting the question, but I think so.
Okay. Well, the thing is that I looked at what are the consequences of projected land use and climate change for the 21st century. I did not consider anything else. I did not look at what will happen if we start, hunting wolves to a lesser degree or a larger degree again. Will it play a role in deciding on that? I guess one could say, well, yeah, it might be a reason. Well, I don't know if that's a very valid argument, but one could say, well, they're not in trouble because of climate change. So at least there's that. That's not a conservation concern. So it seems like they're doing well. Can we say that they're doing well enough for a hunt? Maybe in that manner. It can come into play in policy, like I said, because when they consider the status of a species as endangered or threatened or whatever, climate change is one of the factors they look at, but it's only one of the factors. There's a lot of other factors. So yeah, I can't answer the question for sure how it could be used or will be used in the future.
Sure. We also have a couple of questions that are related to each other and really directly relate to a kind of that, well, the suitable habitat, but also the fact that wolves are dispersing into areas that you would think probably are not going to be a long-term suitable place. The Netherlands that is, and Belgium that are just so crowded and
Yeah.
still they go, and at least they stick around for a little while. And this question is also kind of relating and asking because they're in Japan, where obviously it is really crowded. There are not currently wolves there. So what what do you think would be necessary for them to thrive there, given that they are occupying places that would technically be not suitable habitat?
Yeah. It so yeah, it's suitable habitat in the sense of ecologically. Like I said, wolves are generalists. When it comes to habitat, they are fine with wetlands, grassland, tundra, whatever. I mean, they live on Greenland, which is not a very hospitable place.
It is not.
Um, they are generalists in the true sense of the word, and that is reflected in their diet too. Yes, mostly they prey on ungulates, but in times of scarcity, they can have a majority of the diet can be small voles, or they've been known to have grasshoppers in their diet or berries. They're generalists. They can live in many places. What it really depends on is, are they able to coexist with humans in those places? So as our studies show, well, the more human disturbance of the landscape there is, the less likely it's going to work out, because the wolves will avoid it because they see the risk of humans. So they see a lot of activity of humans, and they're going to avoid that place. And conversely, if they decide to stick around anyways, then there's a high potential for conflict. But it really depends on um, the attitudes of humans towards wolves and how they react to their presence there. And sometimes that doesn't even have to be consciously. For example, here in the States, we've had cases of dispersing wolves that were then shot by hunters who mistook them, supposedly in many cases, mistook them for coyotes. Now, that's something that doesn't really happen very quickly in Europe. Firstly, because we don't have coyotes. So if they would have mistaken the wolf for something, it would have been a dog, and you're not allowed to shoot dogs. So you'd be in trouble anyway. Um, but so then it would seem like, oh well, maybe that's why dispersing wolves in Europe make it to Belgium, for example, and here in the US they might not, because they get shot. Well, that's part of it, but not all of it, because another thing is that dispersing wolves have a lot high likelihood of getting hit by a car, and cars are, unfortunately, they're everywhere. So it really depends on how much impact humans have on the landscape. That really impacts the survivability of wolves, and consequently, that impacts the potential for recolonization of areas that could probably host wolves.
For sure. And that was going to be kind of the next question, was about if you had factored in, or if maybe it was outside of your initial study area, but dispersing wolves that have crossed the border and gone into Iowa, the most recent one, as well as a few others, have been hit by cars. So
Yeah.
did that impact your research, or is that outside of where you were studying?
Well, in general, so what we looked at mostly is human population density, and that correlates pretty well with how dense the road network is, because where there's more people, there's more roads, and so where there's more people, there's more chance to be hit by a car. So again, that we kind of, because I did one other study where I looked particularly at road density, um, and instead of human population density. And really, I believe, although in other for other questions it may matter a lot. What variable you pick is very important in scientific studies. But I think for my questions, it didn't matter as much. It's really more about human disturbance on the landscape overall, whether that's in the form of a lot of farms and agriculture, whether that's in the form of urban areas, whether it's in the form of big dense road networks. It's just how human modified is that landscape, as opposed to a natural landscape where wolves will be confronted with humans and their activities much less often.
Sure. And we have a question about when you studied the gray wolf distribution in southern Canada, did you also include what is considered the Algonquin wolf or the eastern wolf population that is in that area?
That's a very good question, and I was I was pragmatic enough to not take into account any taxonomic debates on all the subspecies of gray wolf, because it would be so difficult to do this analysis, because then you have the timber wolf and the Algonquin wolf, and then you have a lot of places in southern Canada where some then say that those are actually not really wolves anymore because there's too much coyote DNA in them, and I'm I'm an ecologist or whatever, but I'm definitely not a good taxonomist. So that is way beyond me, those genetic studies on the subspecies. And so I avoided it all by just calling wolves wolves. And that's where I left it at.
I'm not sure if Dave Meach has joined us tonight, but he, his standard saying is a wolf is a wolf is a wolf. So there we go. And we have a question about your initial estimates of how were those initial estimates of predicted suitability made? Was it based on where the wolves actually were in an earlier part of the study? How was that determined?
Yeah, so the way in all of these studies, really, the way that we looked at what makes a place suitable for wolves is by using those wolf locations that we got from the snow tracking data. So actually, I'm gonna share my screen real quick and show the map. Maybe it'll be easier if I map. Come on, here we go. So here you have all those presence points, right? Those are all locations that we knew wolves were at between 2017 and 2020. What you do then is you create a lot of locations and you say, well, we're going to assume that wolves were absent at those locations. And we generated thousands of those, what you call pseudo absences. So a place where you assume wolves were not. We created thousands of those all over Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so what you get is you get a lot of gray points here, and then you get a lot of points in another color, which is the pseudo absences, all over the states. And then what the model does, and that's called a species distribution model, is it compares the landscapes at the presence points, so where the wolves were, to the points where the wolves were potentially not. And some of those are going to be wrong. You're going to have some pseudo absence points where you say, for example, here, where you say wolves are absent there, but in fact they were present there. But that's okay because you got thousands of them. So on average, the presence points are going to have a certain average in human population density, which is going to be fairly low, say 7 people per square kilometer. But if you take the average human population density of the pseudo absence points, it's going to be much higher, like 30 people per square kilometers. And that way, the model can make an estimate based on where the wolves are and based on where we assume them to be absent. It can make an estimate of the cutoff. So how much agriculture can a wolf tolerate before it stops being wolf habitat? How much human population density can they tolerate? And those are all model estimates, of course. And we try to make them as accurate as possible, but models are always, they are never perfect. So there's always a degree of uncertainty there. But so that's how you initially estimate wolf habitat suitability. And then once you have that estimate of, okay, that's the cutoff where it stops becoming wolf habitat, that's when you can project it onto an entire different landscape, and it will, based on the variables, so agricultural land cover, human population density, it will use those cutoffs and then categorize different places as being either good or bad wolf habitat. Well, as wolf habitat or not wolf habitat.
Sure. And I think we will wrap it up with this last question. So for those of us in the Northland, and especially kind of in the heart of wolf country here, do you see increasing forest fires affecting wolf distribution in the Great Lakes region?
That's a very good question. That is in fact one of the shortcomings of the last study, which looked at climate change, is we did not take into consideration increased forest fires. That may very well have an effect. Then again, as I did mention a couple of times, so wolves are habitat generalists. So even in a post-fire landscape, as long as there's no human disturbance and as long as there's things to eat, they'll be okay there, even if the fire went through, as long as, you know, they have made it out first out of the fire. But they would return to it, and if there's food, and if there's not suddenly people building houses on where the forest used to be, then it is likely that it will remain wolf habitat. But it could well have large consequences in terms of fire. It could have consequences in terms of direct wolf mortality, wolves not making it out of fires, or the prey depletion, for example, if their prey suffers heavily from fires. For example, another thing people have been looking at a little bit is snow cover, and how the decreasing snow cover in the winter in some areas may then lower the deer population, and in fact how that then may affect wolves. So there's all those intricate patterns that we didn't look at. We just looked at climate change in general and land use change in general. But that's a very good question. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, it is very complicated, but Merijn, thank you so much for joining us. This was a great presentation and great questions from everyone and a great discussion. So we really appreciate it. And there are lots of comments that this was great work. And thank you so much for the information and the presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.